Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Raptor Queens Podcast, the first ever all-women podcast covering the Toronto Raptors. My name is Sarah Khalil, and I am here with my other queens of the North, Essie Magic and Jade Heartless Hoops. We got an interview that was done by Nick Nurse. It was an exclusive interview, and I had the opportunity to attend, so I'm going to cover some of what Nick Nurse had to say about coaching the Raptors and his first season as a rookie coach. There's some really interesting tidbits. We have Vince Carter, who did an interview as well on all the smoke, and he had a lot to say, including a lot to say about the Raptors. So we're going to cover some of that. The NBA may be returning, and there's some news to cover there. And finally, The Last Dance, episode 9 and 10. Those are the last two episodes. They aired, and so we have a coverage or thoughts of the entire series. So that is what we're going to be covering today. Okay, so this week, really exciting. I got to attend this exclusive Nick Nurse interview that was hosted by Blackberry, and he was interviewed by Rod Black from TSN. And it was pretty cool. I got like a kind of a backdoor entry to watch this online interview. And Nick Nurse was there, and it was really fun. I was taking pictures and sending it to the WhatsApp group because I was fangirling really hard about Nick Nurse and how much I love him. And yeah, there are just like a couple highlights that I thought that our listeners would be interested in hearing. And of course, Essie and Jade, if you want to chime in on any of these as I'm sharing them, definitely feel free. One of my favorites was when Nick Nurse was asked what he had to do as a rookie coach with a star player, meaning Kawhi, and another star player who can sometimes be grumpy, and that was Kyle Lowry, and how he had to come in as a rookie coach and deal with that. And what he said was that with Kawhi, he'd never spoken to Kawhi before, but with Kyle, he had already had this relationship with him as an assistant coach. And Kyle came up to him and said, basically, I don't know you as a head coach. We're going to have to, get to know each other again. And so they had to form a whole new dynamic. But then what Nick Nurse did is he basically got together with the whole team, and he's like, okay, we're going to lay out the vision. And he said, we're going to try and we're going to experiment with different things. Some are going to work and some are not. But I want you to come into this open-minded. I'm going to ask you to do things differently that maybe you have not been accustomed to, or maybe anyone else in the NBA has even done. And then he passed out a wristband that said April, May, and June. And he passed that out to the team and to thousands of workers at the entire arena, just to get everyone focused on our best basketball is going to be at the end of this year. And I just thought that was really cool, like how he got buy-in for all of the unique, experiments he was going to run. What did you guys think about that?
I think that's super interesting to know the details of it, because that was one of the things that I noticed all season last season, was that the buy-in was there. It was all the way there. There was you could tell that nobody on the team was worried about the fact that Nick Nurse was doing things differently and drastically differently than they'd done it, drastically different than any other team had done it. And we had a lot of veterans on that team. Like Kyle Lowry's been around the block. Serge Ibaka's been in the league for a long time. Not everybody on the team is really young. So I like now knowing the details of some of what he actually did to accomplish that at the level he did last season.
Yeah, go ahead, Essie.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, and I think it makes sense, and it shows why they were willing to do, a box and one. There wasn't any, whispering behind the scenes of players complaining or whichever. Like, they all bought in, and I think, yeah, having to have a player like Kawhi Leonard on your team in your first rookie season as a coach, I mean, that's not easy. And considering, I'm sure he had heard all the rumors that things were, not doing well and didn't go well in San Antonio. And so that could be a little daunting, knowing you have this player coming in who some made it seem like he was the problem and all that. But I think also too, Masai helped as well, like in that situation. Like, I feel like Masai was probably one of the people that when Kawhi came in was like, listen, we have this goal. We really want to make the finals. This is why you're here. And then, of course, obviously, he was trying to rebuild his, his career and reputation as well. I think more where it's interesting is the situation with Kyle Lowry, because we know that Kyle is like I don't know. I don't want to say like I won't say anything.
If I may, I will say Kyle can be curmudgeonly.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. So that's better than how I would have said it. I think that is very interesting, using the tactics like giving out the wristbands to make the players really believe that this is a new start. This isn't like what it was the year before where we're getting swept and all that stuff. Like we're going to start brand new. Everyone has a chance. Let's do it. Let's get to the finals, And so, and you can tell they were all united on that from the whole season. Even in the times that Kawhi would speak in the media, he would say, our goal is to get to the finals. Our goal is to get to, like, he would repeat the same thing, So you could tell they're all on the same page, and learning tidbits like this kind of helped us to see why they were all so united and so ready to achieve that goal.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of Phil Jackson coming in with the Bulls and getting buy-in on the triangle offense. And even what you were saying about Kyle Lowry and getting his buy-in as well, I think it helps that it was swept in the finals the year before, just like it probably helped that the Bulls had lost again in the playoffs, and where you have a player realize, okay, like what we're doing isn't quite working. So it keeps their minds open in terms of being willing to make a change. One of the other things that was interesting is Nick Nurse was apparently being interviewed for quite a few head coach roles. And like he had this thought in his mind where he's like, I probably will be a head coach in the following season, but he did not think it was going to be with the Raptors, and meaning he did not expect that Dwayne Casey was going to be fired. That's not what he thought was going to happen. And then he got a phone call from Masai and Bobby, and then they said, hey, we're talking to the next head coach of the Toronto Raptors. Come down to the arena and sign your contract. Now, one thing that was a little bit unclear to me was whether or not he interviewed at all for the Raptors, or if all those interviews were just with other teams, and then he was like surprised by the head coach offer with the Raptors. Do either of you know the details on that?
I don't know. This was actually my first time hearing anything about this, like this story of how they just like, oh, come down, we're going to talk with the new head coach, and oh, it's you, type of thing. Yeah. So I personally didn't know. I don't know, Jade, if you knew.
I feel like they must have interviewed him. Just knowing what Masai is like, I feel like he would have had to get some sense of what he would be like as a head coach. And of course he would have had some because he was there as an assistant. But I think that conversation would have needed to be had specifically before Bobby and Masai would be willing to make a call. I think I remember reading about him being interviewed, but now that you have that context of him, of that story, the way that he said it in the interview, I'm not entirely sure anymore.
Okay. Well, either way, I think it was pretty cool, like how he was offered the job, just this phone call from Bobby and Masai asking him to come down to sign a contract. I don't know. I thought it was cool.
I will say though, that I do think that before they revealed it to him, they knew for a long time what they were thinking and planning, because like those type of decisions are not made lightly. And I think the whole time they were kind of maybe priming him to take over without being as forthright, because they had to have known that, with Dwayne Casey, it's like, if we don't win this year, you're out type of thing from a while, right? So I feel like I don't think that was a light decision. I think they knew, they had been thinking about how to overcome a lot of the problems that the team had for a while. And I think it was something they knew for a while, but they just didn't say it.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think if knowing that Dwayne Casey was going to be out, because I mean, they built the roster for Dwayne Casey's coaching style, and then it still didn't work. So that was coming. And I think that we know they did interview a couple other people. I feel like that was really just a formality, more to make sure they had made the right decision with Nick Nurse than any real possibility that they really wanted to go with anyone else.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially because we had such a big task the very next year. It would be difficult to, for the whole team to adjust to a completely new coach and still get to the finals, a brand new star player all in 1 year and get to the finals. Like, I don't know. It was, and especially because we know he was trying to move to, he knew he wanted to move to Mar for some time. So I feel like, it would have been a lot. I think the interviews were arbitrary, like you said.
Okay, cool. Thanks for your thoughts on that. A couple other things that that stood out to me. So you know how Nick Nurse has been kind of calling out his players publicly in the media. So he'll just say something along the lines of, "Man, these guys just aren't playing defense," and then the next day they go out and they perform. So he actually had something to say about that. He's like, "Listen, when there's adversity in the locker room, you want to think about how you approach this, etc. You don't want to embarrass your guys." But he said, sometimes when I can't get a point across in the locker room, but then I say it in a press conference and then it's an article the next day they're better. And so I guess it's just something where he's basically saying, like, I've tried to tell them, but for some reason it hits differently when a media article publishes. I thought that was pretty funny.
Essentially, that's an admission that he uses the media to get his points across. I mean, let's call a spade a spade. I mean,
exactly.
Hey, if it works, it works.
Yeah, and I love that he's obviously very thoughtful about use of the media, right? Because like some players, even some coaches, that they just said whatever they wanted to say because they were frustrated or they were blah blah, like they were whatever in the moment when the question was asked. And it's kind of like, I think of it like a parent disciplining their child out of their anger rather than taking the time to consider a thoughtful punishment. Right. And I kind of think of it like that with Nick Nurse. He's not just saying it to the media just because. It's a deliberate step that he's taken. And if it hadn't worked, he would have stopped. I'm sure he would have stopped. But because it worked, now it's a tool that he's going to continue to use.
I think that's really probably right. And I like that you called it thoughtfulness, because one of the other things that he said was, he said, "I think of my voice as a finite resource. And I don't say very much early in the year. And in the regular season, I mostly let my assistant coaches coach. They're the ones that are reviewing tapes. And I basically don't want my voice to get stale by the end of the year. And so it's at the end of the year when I start taking over, and during the playoffs, etc., where I'm going to be speaking more and taking over those practice, I don't know what you call it, like game reviews." But it's just to your point, like that he is using everything as a tool. I think he is really, really intentional, really thoughtful and methodical, and thinking about the various ways that everything he does, the impact that it could have. Anyway, I walked away from this interview thinking, okay, he's a total genius. And I'm so glad that he's the coach of the Raptors.
Yeah, I definitely think he is top 3 smartest coach in the NBA right now. Even if you just boil it down to being able to go back-to-back seasons, top 3 standings in the league with the amount of injuries we've had. Forget all the other stuff. That by itself is enough for me to be like, he's a brilliant coach. He's going to be an all-time great NBA coach.
Yeah, I think so too. Oh, and then the final thing I'll say about this, just to wrap it up, was it was a corporate sponsored event, and that's fine. But the guy doing the intro was like trying really hard to kind of make it relevant to business. Like he's like, "Oh yeah, leadership in business, blah blah blah," and all I could think was like, "Are you kidding? This is an NBA championship coach. Just say that. Everyone's here because they're fans." And anyway, I was like, "I don't care if this is related to business. This is Nick Nurse. Are you kidding? Let's just listen to this." Anyway, it was good times, and I was really happy I got to be there. Okay, we'll move on to the next topic now, and we're going to let Essie lead this one. We're going to talk about Vince Carter's recent interview. Go ahead, Essie.
Yeah, so Vince Carter was on All the Smoke, which has really become the it podcast these days, because all these players kind of reveal these juicy details or secrets that people didn't know about before. And like past interviews, Vince Carter just did the same thing as well. And of course Toronto came up because it's a big part of his history, and some things really stood out about what he said that are different from how the narrative was before. Something that really stands out is that he made it seem like he was rather pushed out of the organization instead of what we were, kind of made to believe, which is that he just wanted out. You know what I mean? So he said things like the organization was moving towards Chris Bosh as the franchise player instead. And so he kind of was like, okay, well, if you don't want me here, then just move me, type of thing. And that he wasn't originally thinking of moving. And then there were some other things like, by the time he got to New Jersey, he felt like he had something to prove because he was accused of not loving the game. And so that would explain why suddenly he got to New Jersey and was like, a different player, it seemed. He also brought up things where it's like he kind of felt like he was being set up a little. Like he said things like, oh, they wanted him to act a fool in the locker room and kind of maybe, get him to become a problem so that it looks like they should trade him or something, or that he's the problem. And that things like the fact that they were playing around with his minutes, like he would come in and they would pull him out really quickly and things like that. I do remember stuff like that at the time, but it's different kind of hearing him talk about it. And then also too, and then because of that, the whole thing made it look like he was the problem in the media, and that the media made it look like he didn't want to be there. And so it was just really interesting because I haven't heard that perspective of him being pushed out so much, and we've heard it more as in he just kind of wanted out. And then also another interesting tidbit that came out, which is, I don't know if you find it funny or on the lighter side, but he mentioned that his shoes, his signature shoe deal that he had with Nike, the Nike Shocks, Vince was the first one to have those shoes that have those like springs in them. He mentioned that those were that was part of the reason he got injured were the shoes. So that was very interesting, that the shoes, he just didn't obviously want to admit it at the time because they were his sponsor. And so he played through, poor shoes or whichever. So yeah, that was kind of the scoop there. So yeah, I just thought it was really interesting because that's just not the narrative we've seen of him so far. What do you guys think?
Well, sorry, I just want to ask you a quick question. Like listening to it when you were listening, did you find that your perspective was significantly shifted, or were you just kind of left wondering who was telling the truth?
For me, it actually aligned with my perspective because I'm of the perspective that the organization and the management at the time were terrible. I think a lot of times people look at what it's like now. They see Masai, they see Bobby Webster, they see that the team is now willing to spend all this money and, they'll shell out the dough to grow the team. And they kind of put that, view of the team now on what he had then without realizing that, it took years for the organization to get to the point where they actually know how to build a championship team and have a acclaimed now because they've won awards organization. So I think it definitely aligns, and it makes sense because at the time I was wondering when they drafted Chris Bosh at number 4, I believe. I was wondering why didn't they? Because we had just come off these seasons of getting showing momentum in the playoffs. If they were looking to continue that and win now, you would think they would have looked to move that draft pick for a player who was ready to contribute right away, right? And play with Vince and continue that sort of, playoff type of run. So that does kind of line up with, okay, maybe they were looking to, start building the team around a different type of player. Maybe they thought, I know Tim Duncan had been playing really well. And maybe they thought, okay, if we have a big man, we should build around a big man as a star. It was just coming off not too long where Shaq was still one of the top players in the league. So it's possible that, it could have been the case. But the thing that we don't know is we don't know if he was told directly that, or if he just kind of concluded that based off signs, like the things like his mom's parking spot being given away. And I remember he said suddenly he found that he was no longer being included in decision making, and he wasn't told as much, and it's like they were keeping secrets from him and stuff. So we don't know if that he was actually told that we're moving the team in a different direction, or it's just based off of him seeing these signs of like, oh, do they want me here? Is it, or are they shifting to Chris Bosh?
I think I'm gonna say two things about kind of that. The first one is, like you said at the beginning, the management at the time was not good. And I think because we've had such good management for such a long stretch of time now, we're smarter as fans. So we're able to look back at that and say, well, this is really what they should have done. Like your analysis of maybe they should have moved that pick for a veteran is perfectly on point. That's exactly what Masai would have done. And that's why we know that that's what should have happened. But at the time, I think as a fan base, we wouldn't have had that same level of IQ in terms of management because we didn't have good management to learn it from. So I think it's easy to think, well, maybe they should have done this and this and then read something into the fact that they didn't, where I think it's possible that the management was just crappy and they didn't know any better, that would be a smarter thing to do. The other thing about Vince is that he is very revisionist in his own telling of the history. It's not just the media that has said things different ways. So in prepping for this, I didn't have a chance to listen to the podcast, but I did read an article in the Toronto Sun that was kind of breaking it down. And one of the things they mentioned is that, like you said, he doesn't characterize the time as him having quit on the team, that he was pushed out. But he himself has admitted that he quit on the Raptors to Georgetown coach John Thompson years ago. So if it was really just two different stories, we're getting one from Vince and one from the media, I would buy in more that things were more like how he says. But the fact that he changes his story completely the other way around, depending on when you talk to him, I can't really buy into, like, he doesn't have credibility for me because his story hasn't been consistent.
So I do want to talk about that John Thompson interview, because yes, that was a very controversial interview at the time, and it's something that's still brought up to this day. But one thing that was clarified after, and I don't remember the exact quote because this was some time ago and I wasn't expecting you to bring it up, but I'm really impressed that you remembered that, Jade. Is that the way that he said it, and John Thompson said he could have just been standing up for him because it's like, he just, didn't want to throw him under the bus or whatever. But the way that quote came across to me was that when you're blessed with certain talents, sometimes you take it for granted and you don't have to work as hard. You know what I mean? And I think people took that as, oh, he quit on the team. And I think when he said it, even at the time, I took that as more of an admission of, like, it reminded me of when he was seen eating Snickers bar on the bench. You know what I mean? Everyone was like, why is he eating a Snickers bar? And it's like that type of thing where let's face it, Vince Carter was an extremely gifted player. Like, he was just born with this natural ability to jump so high, so athletic, bring his arm full extension for a windmill in game. You know what I mean? And so I feel when that comment came out, that's how I interpreted it when he said it. It's like, oh, when you're so gifted, sometimes you don't have to play as hard. It's not like someone like Kobe like just worked his butt off in the gym at 4 a.m. or waking up at 4 a.m., heading to the gym, shooting however many shots every single day. And I feel like that's not what Vince would do. He would know that has this talent, and like, we never heard stories of, and of course I'm sure you trained, but we never heard those type of stories that we've heard about Kobe and LeBron, how much they train, and now Michael too. How hard they trained to be the way they were. And so that was corrected after, but I had originally interpreted it that way anyway, which is that, he was saying that he didn't play as hard as he should have, or he didn't train as hard as he should have because he knew he just was so talented and didn't need to. It's only when the injuries and stuff started that he had to kind of really change the way he played. So that's how I interpreted that, and it was corrected after. We don't know if that was a lie though, so I'm just saying what my perspective is.
If it was just that one situation where he's done that, I'd probably be inclined to blow it off as well, but there's multiples. So like, I don't know, he just, his story isn't consistent across multiple points across years, and they're back and forth and it's all over the place. So it's one of those things where, like, I always believe the truth is somewhere in the middle between one side's telling and the other. The actual truth is somewhere down the line. I don't think he was as hard done by as he feels like he is. I also don't think he was treated necessarily as well as he should have maybe been treated by the organization.
I can see that. And yeah, he's probably, you know, we're hearing it from his side, but I just think that based on how bad the management was at the time, like, I'm more leaning towards his side. I think it's in the middle, but if it's a spectrum, I think it's still more to his side in the middle, if that makes sense. Sarah, we haven't heard what you think. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit torn about this. I mean, I think about the type of player that Vince Carter is, and I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before or not, but you know, to me, when you say he's talented and he didn't have to work that hard, that makes, to me, that's consistent with what he's about. Like, I think about Vince Carter, and the reason he's played for 22 seasons and is 43 and still playing isn't because he's necessarily driven to win. I think he's literally just driven by the joy of the game, and he plays because he loves it and because it's fun. And you know, like, he even says, I'm not gonna chase rings. Like, I guess I just don't know how important winning as the end goal is. I think he's more interested in having fun, and then maybe he wins. And so when you look at it from that perspective, if you're management and you think, are we going to win with this guy? And then you think, well, I don't know how much it matters to him. Then maybe you can imagine, you know, making decisions and choices that eventually are to have someone else come in and be the player that you build around. And so that could be Chris Bosh, and he could be right. But in terms of being pushed out, I'm not sure, like, because then I wonder, well, if you are being pushed out, it's often because there's some kind of culture clash, culture difference. And so I don't know. I guess I'm not sure. Like, to what Jade said about him being a revisionist when he's talking to the media, I tend to find that his media interviews aren't helpful for him. Like, I don't feel like he really helps himself in making a strong case for himself generally. Like, he's kind of all over the place. So yeah, I don't know. Like, I could imagine it being both ways, but I also just think that there was maybe some petulance when he was still on the team about how it was all being handled. Even if management was crap, there was still some petulance around Vince. So yeah, that's my take.
I just think that it just aligns with a lot of the things that happened at the time, or things more details came out after the fact, I should say. Like the fact that we found out after that he had a physical altercation with Sam Mitchell. You know, would you still want to play? Would you feel comfortable, you know, playing on a team that you physically fought your coach, and, you know, now, you know, the coach has an agenda against you, and like he talked about his minutes being tampered with or whichever, you know, mental games. So it's like the details that came out after the fact tend to align with his story. Also, like if you look at also the fact that Sam Mitchell admitted later, and Rob Babcock confirmed after that the night before the trade, or the night before, I don't know if it was the night before or the day before, I have to find the article again, but that Vince called Sam Mitchell and said, I've changed my mind, I don't want to leave. And you know, Sam Mitchell and he was like, oh, you know, I want to work with the team and let's try to fix things. I want to stay moving forward. And Sam Mitchell at the time told Rob Babcock, who was like already, and said, oh no, it's too late. We already made a verbal agreement on the trade, and I don't want to backtrack on it. And then Sam Mitchell admitted that he wished at the time he would have escalated that to Maple Leaf Sports, like what Vince told him, to Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment, and kind of gone past Rob Babcock, again, kind of realizing that Rob Babcock was a terrible GM, unfortunately. So like the stories just kind of add, like the details that have come up after the fact tend to lend itself to what Vince is saying, is that he didn't feel comfortable there anymore. And also to the fact that he had just re-signed with us. Vince Carter was the first big player to re-sign with the Toronto Raptors. It was a big deal because no player had done that before. It was like, as soon as a rookie contract is done, I am out. And back then, they used to do the contracts really long. It was like 7 or 6 years after your rookie contract. And he had re-signed for, I think, a 6-year contract with the Raptors. So it just, the 180 that happened, it just was so weird. You know, how can you commit to this long-term contract in a, like we all are insecure about, in a completely different country, and, you know, as a player who's never done that before, because players didn't do that at the time for Toronto. They didn't want to be there, the whole Canada stigma. So it does, to me, it aligns with, you know, his story. I think it aligns with what happened. And also too, I just remembered, I don't know if it was coincidence they recorded it this way, but an episode with Tracy McGrady just came out after the Vince Carter one. And he said and it was like a short sentence thing. He was just like, the way the organization was, like, you know how he admitted after the fact that he wished he would have stayed because he thinks they would have been in the finals and playing against the Lakers and all this stuff. He said with the way the organization was at the time, there's no way he could have stayed. And when he said that, I was just like, you know, was this just a big mess behind the scenes? And that one was surprising to me because at the time, we still had Glenn Grunwald, who I thought was pretty decent GM at the time. So that was shocking me because I know it was like, okay, it's not just the GM, maybe it's the whole organization that was kind of messed up at the time. So that to me was also like kind of an added fact that I heard after, that was like, oh, okay, that kind of adds to what Vince is saying as well, is that the organization was just, you know, it was new, it wasn't ready, it was a learning experience, and things could have been messed up. So yeah.
You make some very good points, Saucy. You may have swayed me.
Not me, sorry.
Okay, go ahead. Why didn't I sway you?
I don't think when you have, like, a lot of the points you made actually confirm for me that Vince was a big part of the problem too, because he was that big player. He was that guy that re-upped it in a team that nobody was doing that with. And I don't think any NBA management is so bad that they have not considered that at all when they decide, okay, our only choice now is to let him go. I think, like I said, I think there's fault both sides, and I don't think I'm gonna be unswayed with Vince. I've always was pretty indifferent because I wasn't watching a lot of basketball when Vince Carter was playing. But until he comes out and takes some ownership for the stuff that happened, because all I've ever heard of it was the organization. That's never true. There's always something both sides could have done to improve the situation. There's always something both sides did that damaged the situation. And I have a hard time taking people seriously when they place all the blame on the other party.
Okay, so you're saying you're not necessarily dismissing it. It's just because of the fact that you think that it's middle ground, and you think that he should be taking some responsibility at least, right, for what happened.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know then, because the thing is like, if he genuinely doesn't feel like he did anything wrong, why would he take responsibility for something if he feels like he didn't do anything wrong? You know what I mean?
If he genuinely feels like he didn't do anything wrong, then he's a person whose self-awareness is not high enough for me to buy his story.
That you're saying that is wrong in itself.
Yeah, like I completely respect people's right to feel like they didn't do anything wrong, but like in my experience, that's never 100% true.
Right. I don't know. I'm gonna like I said, I'm buying into his story. He just did. It was too much of a 180. He just did so much for the city. Like, I still remember when he had those charity, basketball games. At the time it was called the Air Canada Center, that would sell out, and he did those twice in a year. Those charity basketball games, and he would intentionally invite all these star players to come. I remember Dwayne Wade came and Ray Allen came because he was trying to recruit players to Toronto and be an advocate for Toronto. And even I remember at the time we were going for the Olympic bid. We were trying to get the Sydney Olympics, and he even showed up at the Olympic bid, which really didn't have much to do with basketball, but was trying to be an ambassador for Toronto. And I think that, like, the things he used to do for the city, it showed that he genuinely cared about the city, and he genuinely loved the city and wanted to be a part of it. And so to just do a complete 180, I'm sorry, I'm on Vince's side. I'm just gonna call a spade a spade. I'm on Vince's side. I think that the organization did him wrong, and then that's what resulted from it. I think that the circumstances were such that, who would want to stay in those circumstances? That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having such a strong opinion about it. On that note, we're going to move over to our tea time segment, and specifically, we're going to take a look at some of what's going on in terms of the return of the NBA. So, Jade, why don't you take us away?
So, there's been lots of buzz. There's still lots of questions, but we're starting to see some structure of what the concerns are, which to me is a good sign. Because if there's enough talk to know what the concerns are, that means there's enough planning going ahead that people are thinking about how's it going to work. So where we are, all of this information comes from Woj's article on ESPN about the conference call that happened, I believe, yesterday with people from the NBPA, GMs, whoever else was involved in that call. So right now it's looking like the return of the season is going to be at Disney World Orlando. They are leading in the talks for creating kind of a campus environment for the NBA teams to go and play in isolation. Bubble is what they're calling it. The plans right now would include a 2-week recall for teams to their own markets, and then they would have to quarantine for 2 weeks. 1 to 2 weeks of individual workouts at team facilities after the quarantine period, 2 to 3 week formal training camp. And as things stand now, owners and higher ups in the NBPA believe that the green light will come from Adam Silver to return in June, and games expected to return by the end of July. So we have a little bit of a hopeful timeline. This is barring any kind of big increase again in COVID infection numbers. But with this loose layout, there are some concerns. Some of them are logistical. So one that affects us as Raptors fans specifically is Kyle Lowry has concerns because he's been working out in Philadelphia. So if this plan goes ahead, he now has to go in quarantine for 2 weeks, come back to Toronto and quarantine for 2 weeks, wherein he can't work out. So he's going to lose 2 weeks of what he's already been doing, and then have to go again to Orlando and quarantine again, because once again, he's crossing the border. And so we're looking at 4 weeks where all of the working out he's been doing in Philly is going to be lost because of the idea that he has to return to Toronto first. So he is with many other players who have been doing similar things that want to avoid that. Another logistical issue is a lot of players have returned overseas to their homes. And the process for having people come back into North America from overseas is unproven, it's uneven, there's no set procedure. It could take longer, it could take shorter. It's kind of a big question mark on how that's going to work. The third thing in terms of logistics is, because they haven't made a decision on what a return to the season would look like, do all the teams need to go to Orlando? The idea seems to be that it's unlikely that all 30 teams would go. But should they decide that they want to do more than just the 16 playoff teams for each conference, the teams that are standing outside of playoffs right now would have to figure out a way to decide who's going to be in the playoffs, because some of those races for the 8th spot in both conferences were very, very close when the season shut down. So on the one hand, it's probably not fair to some of those teams that had a legitimate shot at that 8th spot for them to just take the standings as they were. On the other hand, some of the teams at the very bottom, they don't want to be playing games that could disrupt where they're sitting in the lottery. They just want to keep their lottery pick where it is. They're also not going to want to risk injury to veteran players for games that are essentially meaningless for them because they knew they were out. They're just already looking ahead to the draft. So there's that to think about too. And then in terms of what they're thinking about for the solution to how the season is going to return, another reason they're thinking not all 30 teams is because it reduces the risk of infection, the less people that they have to have. So that's part of it. And then on the league side, so we talked about why the teams, especially the lower seeded teams, aren't necessarily going to want to play any more games. But on the league side, completing more regular season games for everybody is going to affect the equitability of weighing the draft lottery. So there's that to consider. But the even bigger thing to consider is that the more games they're able to get in, the better it's going to be for revenue, which is a big deal. The NBA is a huge corporation. It has been hit hard having to have been off for all of these months from a financial standpoint. So the more games that they can get back on TV is going to be better. And then kind of the final overall thing is that the owners and GMs are looking for an answer as soon as possible, in part because they're saying that the voluntary workout environment that has opened over the past week or so has already lost their novelty to some of the players. So they're losing their momentum and they're losing interest in working out alone. So the next conference call is scheduled for next Friday, and we should hopefully get some more information then.
Thank you for that very, very thorough rundown of everything. That's excellent. Essie, what do you think about it?
It definitely is a light at the end of the tunnel. I think this is good news for all best basketball fans. We had some people saying, oh, it should just be canceled. And, some people saying they thought it would be canceled. And some people saying, oh, it shouldn't be canceled. So to get some actual, what sounds like factual information, because it came from Woj, to get that info shows that, wow, it's like, oh, we actually could be coming back. Oh my goodness. You know what I mean? Which is like, should we start getting excited now? Like this is like, sounds like the real deal, right? So I do think that, I don't think every team should come back though. Like when you were saying that stuff about the draft picks and stuff, Jade, I just thought, oh, Golden State Warriors, don't bring them back. Like teams like that, like just stay home. You're not needed anymore. But yeah, for the teams that were battling for the 7th, 8th seed, those teams, I think there has to be some sort of play-in tournament for them to be able to get into, to have a chance still. How that would work, I'm not really sure. I don't know if it would be a separate tournament. I don't know if it would be worked into kind of a regular season so that all the players across all teams can, get in a rhythm again. Like, I'm not sure how they would do that. Or it could just be, regular season games again, and then that's their chance to get in, is those regular season games. I think it would make it very exciting though if they did some sort of new tournament style for those teams that are trying to fight for those last spots. And I definitely agree with the situation with the Raptor players and Kyle Lowry, and how like they definitely should not have to go back to Toronto. It makes no sense to me. Like, it just go to where the bubble is, Orlando, and just start there. Our player personnel who are currently in Toronto should be the ones to just head over and be there to receive our players when they arrive in Orlando. It just makes no sense for them to come to Toronto first, given that the whole quarantine again, and our government has different regulations and things like that, or its own regulations, I should say. It just, yeah, I'm on board with that. They definitely should not have to come back. And then the players who are already still in Toronto, obviously they would just head over to the Orlando bubble and start their quarantine like all the other players are. So yeah, I think it's interesting, and hopefully, it doesn't fall through. Hopefully there's no big catastrophic event that throws it off again. Yeah, so sounds exciting.
Yeah, makes you realize how much needs to be considered, including just general fairness to all the teams, right? Like if you have all of these teams from 7 to 9 doing their own tournament, but the other teams aren't playing, are the 7 to 9 players more? Are they more tired, or they have more experience and they're back in game shape? Like there's something about sameness across all of the teams that I think is just important for players to get a sense that the game is, not stacked one way or another, and that it's fair to everyone. A lot to consider, definitely, if you're Adam Silver or anyone else that's planning the return.
I don't envy being Adam Silver right now. I mean, he's handling it, I think, as well as anybody could. One of my favorite people is Hassan Minhaj. So I watched his little thing that he did this week about how he wishes Adam Silver was running the States rather than Trump. And he kind of ran down all of the right decisions that Adam Silver has made throughout all of this, and how he's still making the right decisions in terms of not rushing to come back. So yeah, like definitely props. I think every NBA fan should be giving props to Adam Silver, because this is an unprecedented situation, and I'm sure in hindsight we'll be able to see ways that he could have done it better, because that's how hindsight works. But in terms of what we know now and what we've seen, I think he's doing as well as could be expected in handling it.
Yeah, and I think that shows even just in terms of the logistics that are being dealt with right now. Like first and foremost, they're finding how would we even get everyone to the same place safely? Mm-hmm. And then the next conversation seems to be more along the lines of who will play and how will we set up the play. So I think he definitely has his priorities, and in order, he's solving the problems in the right order, because if the first one's not solved, why bother with the other one? So yeah, there's a lot of good stuff happening there.
I will say though, and of course I agree with the whole Adam Silver stuff, but like that reporter that you mentioned, Hassan, for some reason I don't really take him that seriously, because wasn't he the one who's in that video clip that keeps resurfacing where he said the Raptors should be removed from the playoffs or something? Or I don't know if you guys know what video clip I'm talking about.
I would have to look and see, because I feel if I knew that was him, that would affect my opinion of him. But his Netflix show is really insanely informative on like social issues, while still being very funny and entertaining. But like he digs really deep into social issues and explains the stuff that nobody is talking about. So that's kind of why I respect and enjoy him quite a bit. But yeah, I'll have to see if that was for sure him or not.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about the same person, I in general, I like his takes. Like that's why I was shocked when I saw this old video that came out, because in general, I like what he says and what he, his takes on ESPN and stuff like that. But then when I saw this video, I was like,
oh, he's not on ESPN. He's not a sports guy. He was on the Daily Shows before.
Hassan, what's his last name?
Minhaj.
Minhaj.
He's not a sports guy. He likes basketball.
Okay. We're talking about different people. I'm talking about this guy who's on ESPN. Okay.
That's a relief because I love Hassan Minhaj. So if he was bad mouthing my Raptors, that would be a problem for me.
Ooh, disaster avoided. Okay, so we'll move on to our last topic now, which is to cover the final 2 episodes and the series as a whole of The Last Dance. Now, these last 2 episodes mostly covered the Bulls' 7-game matchup against the Indiana Pacers and the back-to-back finals matchup against the Utah Jazz, with, of course, an emphasis on Michael. We got some spotlight on Steve Kerr as well, some stuff with Scottie, and Phil Jackson. So Let's see. I think the question I'm going to ask, I'll pose it first to Essie, is Essie, did the series as a whole, how did it affect, if at all, your opinion or viewpoint of Michael Jordan?
So okay, so let me talk about the documentary as a whole in general. So I do want to say that I think the documentary was phenomenal. I thought they did a good job
I agree.
of telling the story. The way they edited it in a way that was easier to understand. So I liked how they would show the timeline, literally the graphic on the screen, and show, okay, we're moving from The Last Dance to 1980 something or whatever, and then bounce back and kind of give context to some of the moments at the last season. So I do want to say I thought the documentary overall was done really well, and the fact that they were very objective. They didn't try to skew it to, and he was an executive producer, so he could have easily skewed it to, show him in a different way. But they were very objective, and they're like, we're going to show you the good, we're going to show you the bad, we're going to show you the ugly. Like, I liked how they showed so many different sides, and so overall, I want to say the documentary was very well done, and the fact that they got so many viewers watching, I think that is a testament in itself that it was a good documentary to put together. So I will say that in terms of it changing my opinion of Michael Jordan, not really. And I know we kind of talked about this the week before about how we differ on, or actually you weren't on that episode, but with Jade, we differ on our views of Michael Jordan changing. But like I said, it's just typically really, really good players, and by extraordinary players, they have some sort of thing to them that's what makes them who they are. And so I wasn't surprised. I think for me overall, it was more of an educational thing because, I wasn't really watching basketball at that time. Maybe saw some highlights because my sister was more into it, but so it was more educational than anything, and interesting to learn about this generation of basketball that I didn't really get to be a part of at the time because I either wasn't born or I was too young. So so it was more educational for me, but it didn't change my view of Michael Jordan at all because my expectations just weren't. I didn't see him as this role model or godlike type of figure in the first place. So, yeah.
Okay, super clear. Jade, what about you?
So I thought the documentary as well was very well put together. I will say, for me, the jumping around and trying to talk about it after the fact became a little bit challenging for me, just because my brain works more linear than that. So having it bounce back and forth all over the seasons got to be a little bit challenging for me by the 10th episode. But other than that, I thought it was good. I thought it was interesting, Essie saying that it seemed really balanced and unbiased. I have a very different take on that because I just feel like Michael Jordan knows he was the jerk of all jerks and he's fine with it. And so it wasn't so much as unbiased as it was Michael Jordan saying, yeah, I'm a jerk, deal with it. And I think that's why it was like the good and the bad. For me, the fact that he came out looking as bad as he did to me, knowing that this was his cut, is very telling to me in terms of how bad it probably really was, because it's probably a lot worse than what he actually approved going into the editing process and the approval process. And in terms of your question, yeah, we talked about this last week when you weren't here, Sarah, but I have revoked my personal Michael Jordan GOAT card because I refuse to call anybody great who treats other human beings as poorly as Michael Jordan treated people in general. And especially due to the fact that he showed he is capable of treating people well in some of the stories, like the story about his guard when he got sick. He's capable of being compassionate and empathetic and all of that kind of stuff. So I just don't agree with being willing to completely turn that off in the pursuit of winning and still deserving to be called great. Because to me, greatness needs to be across all aspects of who you are as a person, not just as a player. So he is now the best basketball player of all time for me, but I refuse to use the word great in the same sentence as his name.
In that case, though, then nobody's great because nobody's perfect. Like,
I agree.
Is it Mother Teresa we're talking about?
I've dispensed with an NBA GOAT altogether. It's not a conversation I think is a fair conversation to begin with, just because every player's era, any player that you might consider in that conversation, their era was different than all the other players, you might say, right? Wilt Chamberlain's NBA was very different than Jordan's NBA, was very different than LeBron's NBA, was different than Bill Russell's, was different than Larry Bird's. Like, you can't compare guys that didn't play against each other in the same kind of environment, against the same other players in the same time periods. So yeah, my official stance on NBA is that I don't have a GOAT. I have a list of all-time bests, and that's as far as I'm going.
I do want to say something about your point, though, about him, like in terms of not being objective or whichever, or him being like, oh, I'm a jerk, deal with it, I don't care. I would believe that if he didn't cry at the end of that one episode. The tears there says he knew something about it was wrong. So that is where I'm not on board with what you said, because then why did he cry at the end of that episode?
Which episode?
The one that showed him the most as a jerk. At the end, he cries and he's like, break time, and it ends on that note. Do you not remember him crying? That would explain your view.
I don't remember him crying. I'll have to go back. I mean, obviously, I'm going to binge the whole thing now that they're all available at once at some point in the future. But still, like, I don't know. To me, crying after the fact doesn't do much for me, because you still treated people poorly when you didn't have to.
But it's still your point about, you know, him, like the editing in terms of him, whether he was objective or not. Like, I feel like to that point you made, it doesn't fit, just because.
I mean, it's one moment of crying in 40 minutes times 10 episodes of I'm a Jerk.
No, but he knew, like you said, he, you know, how you said that, oh, you think he knew he was a jerk. He was just like, I'm a jerk, deal with it type of thing. I feel like he knew some of it wouldn't make him look good, because that was what your point was that, you know.
I actually don't think I agree with your statement at all that he would think I'm a jerk, deal with it. I actually don't know if he relates to himself as a jerk at all. And like,
you think he's unaware of it?
No, I actually don't think that that's how he thinks of himself. I don't think he thinks of himself as a jerky person. I think he thinks of himself as somebody who pushes people beyond their edge in a way that they actually get to come with him on a journey through to win a championship. And so I don't think there's any way that I can explain my position without it making it seem like I'm justifying and rationalizing bullying. But I actually walked away from this documentary thinking that I had more respect for Michael Jordan as a player and as a leader, which is weird to say. Like, I do think that there are times he crossed the line. I think he knows when he did, including the time he punched Steve Kerr, which is straight up like, wow, you punched this guy. But immediately he says, I knew I crossed the line. And he calls up Steve and he deals with it, and then they end up getting over it, which is, in a way, I kind of think is like more of a dude thing to do, to be like, we have a problem, let's beat each other up, and then they're over it, versus, you know, the traditional stereotypical way that girls deal with it, which is to have our passive aggressive moments. And so there's just, I don't know, like I related to it like someone who walked the edge all the time, like really all the time, and sometimes slipped over the edge. And yes, it's true that he did, but like I appreciated and can respect that he was willing to overstep and occasionally make a mistake and then have to go back and clean it up with people, instead of being so afraid that he might make a mistake that he didn't even come close to his edge. So there is something, for me, I watched that and I think that's a really, really unusual, remarkable type of person to, you know, just be around. I can't imagine it would be easy for a lot of people to be around, and it would totally challenge you at all times when you were in his presence. But I don't know, I walked away being like, that's extraordinary.
I would
never want to be in a relationship with him. I would never be like, man, I wish I was his girlfriend. I think that would be awful.
I'm so happy you said that though, Sarah, because I'm sitting here like, did I watch the same documentary as Jade? Like, I feel like we watched completely different documentaries. So I'm really relieved to hear you say that I'm not the only one that is like, didn't change my opinion of him at all, like from this. Like, and yeah, I did love seeing how great of a player he was. And it was a very educational experience for me.
Yeah, and I did watch his prime years, like those. I remember when he took that game-winning shot against Utah, the final shot. I remember the commentator saying, "Is this the last shot we'll ever see of Michael Jordan, or is this the last image?" And just being like goosebumps. Like, I don't know. I've always been a Michael Jordan fan. Watching this certainly, solidified my own opinion of him, that he's like I think he's the greatest of all time. But like, I thought it was really insightful to get a sense of like I guess the other thing is, again, I don't know, this might sound like I'm just justifying a bunch of bullying behavior, but I actually think it's a really courageous way to be with people. It's really quite courageous to be like, I'm going to risk that they're going to hate me. I'm going to risk being told that I'm a bully. I'm going to risk being, I don't know, just like being called out and not liked and all these other things, but I'm going to do that for the people on my team so that they become better and so that we achieve our goals together. Like, I think that's risky leadership, and most people don't do it, and most people aren't willing to do it. Did it cross the line sometimes? Yes, I agree, it crossed the line sometimes, but I appreciate the risk he was willing to take, and his own personal, the way people related to him mattered less to him than bringing them along and achieving their goal. So that's another way of looking at it. Go ahead.
I find that interesting because I do have several leadership positions in my current capacity at Belly Up Sports, and I am very much of that opinion that I don't care if you like me or not. I have a job to do, and I'm going to tell you how it is. I very much have that mentality of I don't care if you don't like me after, but I still manage to toe the line between I tell people exactly how it is, but I can still just talk with them about their lives. I have a lot of loyalty with the people that work with me. Nobody is afraid of me, but I still get things done, and things get done properly, and people know I expect things to get done properly. So I think partially it's my own personality in being a leader, knowing I'm a leader, and knowing how I've been able to accomplish exactly what needed to be accomplished, being the person generally in the room with higher standards than everybody else, and still being kind, still being somebody people will come to when they're having a bad day, or they need to talk about something, or they need support. And maybe it's because I'm a woman that I can do both, and Michael Jordan couldn't. But I know for a fact that it's possible to get results at very, very high levels and not be a bully. So it's a thing that I'm never going to be able to reconcile to each other when it comes to him.
I think that we have to like be careful though when we're comparing like our own situations with these guys, because remember, we're dealing with, a $1 billion business, millions of dollars, his entire legacy was on the line. And so I don't know. I just think we have to be really careful when we compare our situations, and it's something that I never do in general. One thing that would come up when I remember when the whole Kawhi thing about him going to LA, because I live in LA, people would ask me, "Oh, what do you think? You live in LA. Do you get why he?" And I always say I don't like to compare myself because I'm not in that situation in terms of like the way that the NBA and the players are. It's like they're in a whole different context with us. There's so many, there's so much money on the line. There's endorsements. There's all sorts of accolades and legacy. So I just think we should be careful when we compare in that type of way.
I understand all that, but I know that I would never sacrifice the way I treat people, any people, because there's money involved, or because there's a legacy involved, or because there's anything else. Like my standards for myself and the way that I behave, no amount of money would allow me to treat people the way Michael Jordan treated people.
I think this is the difference though, Jade, and I'm not saying he's right necessarily, but you think of this, and you're not wrong either. But so I think you think of it as like he's treating people poorly. I actually do not think that he went in there thinking I'm treating people poorly. I don't think he did. I think he was thinking I'm treating you in a way that's going to have you be the best player you're ever going to be. And it didn't occur to him that that was poor treatment. And I think it was a completely different way of relating to what it takes to bring out the greatest in people. Now, is it the only way to bring out greatness in people? No, absolutely not. And I think that he is a very, 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 you know, if we're going to use feminine masculine dynamics, he has a very masculine way of doing that. And maybe that works in an NBA that is, you know, all dudes and it works. Maybe they'll respond. Women, I don't think that would work at all. And also, I think that we would bring a lot more of a, you know, a feminine type of energy to, you know, bringing out the best in someone. Now, again, I don't think that this is the only way to do leadership. I don't even necessarily think it's always the right way to do leadership. I just think it was an interesting insight into how he viewed it. And I do not think he viewed it as I'm treating you poorly. I don't think that that was his understanding of how he related to people. That's all.
And also
I'm not saying that he was right.
But to add to your point, Sarah, too, that makes a lot of sense because remember, these guys come up in these systems where they are, you know, from high school to college, they have coaches screaming at them. They have all this locker room stuff. Like, I feel like he wouldn't think that that was necessarily wrong at that time. You know, it just the way things are, especially back in the day, you know, they like, players, like it just was not the way people view things now. It's just not how it was. And I feel like he wouldn't even think that that was wrong, like Sarah said, because of, you know, who knows what the way coaches spoke to them back in the day, but we know they weren't easy on them. There was a lot of pressure on them. You got to do this if you want to get to the NBA, if you all know that, you know, college basketball is a big thing as well. So it's like, I agree with you. I don't think he would be thinking, I'm trying to, you know, I'm going to hurt this person and give them mental health problems and all this stuff. That, like, I don't think that that's the way he would be thinking about that.
No. Okay, but even if that was true at the time, he is still alive now. He has seen the way that society has progressed. For me to be more towards your guys' side, I would have needed to see more in the way of him saying, yeah, that's what it was like at the time. I understand that maybe that wasn't the best way to do it, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't know. I just don't feel like he cared. And maybe you're right, and it's that he didn't see it that way, but I don't think him not seeing it that way is a justification for his actions. I mean, back in that day, there was lots of things that were accepted that we know now are not acceptable behavior, like the way women were often treated in terms of some kind of adult things that I won't really get into because I know it's a family show, but like there was lots of things that were justified at the time that now we are saying, no, it wasn't right. And it doesn't matter what the time period was. It still wasn't okay. And that's just where he falls under that kind of category for me. That can I understand that at the time it would have been considered that it wouldn't have occurred to him that it was bad behavior. Fine, I can get that, but I can't be the person that says, well, because it was at the time, I'm cool with it. I'm just not.
And I'm not saying that because I don't know if I agree with your underlying statement that it was bad behavior. Like straight up, I don't know if I agree with that. And that could make me seem like a total crazy person. Maybe I'm really wrong to say that. But
for Judd Blucher to have said everybody was afraid of him, like to me that was a statement that stuck out, and it wasn't just him. Everybody said they were afraid. That was the thing that Reggie Miller said was different about him, was that he wasn't afraid of Michael Jordan, where everyone else was afraid of Michael Jordan. And
John Stockton said that too. So there were like at least two examples in that where people weren't afraid. So when people say everyone is afraid, I'm like, who are you talking about?
The vast majority of people were afraid of him. They genuinely afraid of him, including his teammates.
But
I don't
wait a
know. Do
minute,
you think Scotty was afraid of him?
I think he would have been at
No.
moments.
I don't think so. And like, I don't know. I'm not sure.
But there's a big difference. When we say afraid, there's a big difference of the afraid that Reggie and John Stockton were talking about, and afraid as in his teammates are afraid of him, right? Because the way Reggie and John Stockton meant it, they meant in terms of gameplay. Like obviously, if a player is way better than you, you're gonna be intimidated when that player is gonna, cross you up. You know what I mean? Like so that's a very different afraid than the teammates. But even the teammates being afraid of him, like of course they're gonna be afraid of him, even if he was nicer or whatever you think he should have been. He's the best player on the team. You know what I mean? You have to have a certain kind of no matter what, when he walks into a room, there's an aura about him that's daunting. The best player in the league is on your team. Like you're gonna be somewhat intimidated or nervous or afraid or whatever with someone like that on your team, even if he was super, nice and how you wanted him to be. And I do also want to add, like, to your point of he hasn't really admitted it, or he hasn't really said something after the fact. Now that he knows, he will never, ever, ever say that there was anything wrong with that. And you want me to tell you why? Because he won 6 rings. Who's to know if he was soft on them or whichever, that they would have been motivated enough to win those 6 rings. So he will never, that's like an expectation that I just will, like, I don't think that's the right expectation. He'll never say something like that. And like Sarah said, I don't think he thinks he did anything wrong. I think it's one of those things, again, in hindsight, that when you look back and it's like, okay, he was a little harsh, with like Steve Kerr and stuff like that. But it at the time, he wouldn't have seen that as wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think we have thoroughly exhausted this topic, and we are past our recording, I think. So I think it's time for us to wrap this up. Do you have any final comments before we do?
I think next week, though, we should revisit, because we did have plans to talk about Scottie Pippen apparently being upset by the documentary and Horace Grant. Yeah. So I think next week there's definitely room to still talk about that. So everyone should tune in next week. You can hear our takes.
That's a great idea. All of you should tune in next week, and you should tell your friends about this podcast and share it with everyone, and just generally at Raptor Queens on all platforms: Twitter, Buzzsprout, Apple, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram. We love having you with us every week, and look forward to talking to you all again next week. Thanks, everyone. Stay Raptors fans, and goodbye.
Bye.